Everyone learns the same date in school, September 1st, 1939. German soldiers cross into Poland and the Second World War begins. It's a clean answer. It fits on a timeline. It gives students one villain, one invasion, and one place to point a finger. And it is almost completely misleading, because the war that killed more people than any other event in human history did not start with a single army crossing a single border. It started decades earlier, in rooms far from any battlefield, in decisions made by bankers, diplomats, industrialists, and politicians who never fired a shot but who built, brick by brick, the conditions that made catastrophe unavoidable. Today, we're going to walk through what actually happened, starting long before 1939, and we're going to look at the parts of this story that rarely make it into a classroom. The peace treaty that planted the seeds of resentment, the invasion on the other side of the planet that nobody stopped, the corporations that kept doing business with a regime they knew was dangerous, and the diplomacy that bought time at a price paid by other people. By the end of this video, you'll understand why so many serious historians increasingly argue that 1939 isn't really the beginning of the story at all. It's closer to the end of it. This isn't about rewriting history for the sake of being provocative. It's about noticing how comfortable the standard version of this story has become and asking why. A single villain is easy to teach. A single date is easy to memorize. A single invasion is easy to condemn without implicating anyone else, but comfort and accuracy aren't the same thing. And when the subject is the deadliest conflict in recorded history, comfort is exactly what we should be suspicious of. Let's start in a palace outside Paris, because that's genuinely where this begins. In June of 1919, the leaders of the victorious Allied nations gathered at the Palace of Versailles to formally end the First World War. What they produced was a treaty that was supposed to guarantee peace. Instead, it planted a landmine with a very long fuse. Germany was stripped of roughly 1/10 of its territory. Its most productive industrial regions were carved away, its coal handed over as reparations, and its colonies redistributed among the winners. Its army was capped at a fraction of its former size, and its navy was gutted entirely. Then came the clause that mattered most psychologically, Article 231, which forced Germany to formally accept blame for causing the entire war. The British economist John Maynard Keynes, who sat in on the negotiations, warned almost immediately that the numbers being demanded were not just harsh, but economically impossible, and that trying to enforce them would destabilize the entire continent. He resigned from the British delegation in protest. He turned out to be right in the worst possible way, though it would take another decade for the full consequences of his warning to become visible. By the early 1920s, the German government was printing money to try to meet its obligations, and the result was a currency collapse so severe that people needed wheelbarrows of cash to buy bread. Savings that families had built over a lifetime vanished in a matter of months. A functioning middle class, the group that usually stabilizes a democracy, was financially wiped out almost overnight. American loans eventually helped stabilize the German economy for a few years in the mid-1920s, creating an illusion of recovery. But that recovery was built on borrowed money, and when Wall Street collapsed in 1929, those loans dried up instantly. German unemployment exploded, climbing from roughly 1 million people to well over 6 million within a few years. That's when a fringe political party that had won only a handful of parliamentary seats a few years earlier suddenly became one of the largest parties in the country. It's not a coincidence. Desperate, humiliated populations look for someone who promises to restore their pride and someone to blame for their suffering. The Treaty of Versailles didn't cause Hitler by itself, but it built the emotional and economic soil he needed to grow in. Now here's where the standard timeline gets something fundamentally wrong. It treats the war as a European story that starts in 1939, but 8 years earlier, on the other side of the globe, a different kind of aggression had already begun, and the world's response to it set the template for everything that followed. In September of 1931, Japanese military officers detonated a small explosive near a railway line they themselves controlled in Manchuria, in northeastern China. The damage was so minor a train passed safely over the same tracks shortly afterward. That didn't matter, because the explosion was never really about the railway. It was a manufactured excuse. Japanese commanders blamed Chinese saboteurs, launched a full military assault within hours, and within months had occupied the entire region, installing a puppet state they called Manchukuo. It was a territory roughly the size of France. The League of Nations, founded specifically to prevent this kind of unchecked aggression, responded with an investigation. A commission was formed, took over a year to produce a report, and eventually concluded that yes, Japan was the aggressor. Japan's response was to simply walk out of the League entirely, and the League's response to that walkout was essentially nothing. No sanctions with teeth, no coordinated military response, no consequence that mattered. China would go on to suffer under Japanese occupation for over a decade, including the horrific massacre in Nanjing in 1937 that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. But the deeper significance of Manchuria wasn't really about China at all. It was about what the rest of the world learned from watching and faced nothing but strongly worded reports. Mussolini tested the same lesson in 1935 when he invaded Ethiopia, and the League's response was a sanctions regime so full of loopholes it barely slowed the Italian military down. Hitler tested it again in 1936 when he sent troops into the Rhineland, a region the Versailles Treaty had explicitly required to stay demilitarized. France had every legal right to respond with force and the military capacity to do it. France did nothing. Each time a major power got away with open aggression, it wasn't just a win for that country. It was a lesson for every other ambitious regime watching from the sidelines. The international system built after the First War had no actual enforcement mechanism. It could write reports. It could not stop tanks. And every diplomat and general in Berlin, Rome and Tokyo understood that distinction perfectly, and each one quietly filed it away as a working assumption for everything that would come next in the years ahead. There's another part of this story that most textbooks brush past quickly, and it deserves more attention than it usually gets. The role American and European businesses played in building up the very regime the world would eventually go to war against. This isn't a fringe conspiracy theory. It's documented, and some of the numbers are staggering. By the time Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, American corporate investment inside Nazi Germany was estimated at nearly $500 million. Standard Oil of New Jersey, the company that would eventually become Exxon, had well over $100 million invested in the German economy. General Motors and Ford both had substantial stakes as well. Many of these companies expanded their German operations well after 1933, after the nature of the regime was already unmistakable. Ford's history here is particularly uncomfortable. Henry Ford had spent years publishing openly anti-Semitic material that Hitler himself later cited as an influence. In 1938, just months before the horror of Kristallnacht, the German government awarded Ford its highest honor available to a foreigner, and Ford accepted it. Meanwhile, Ford's German subsidiary was converting to military production, and by the early 1940s, a significant share of the trucks used by the German army had rolled off Ford assembly lines inside the Reich. When American forces eventually liberated those factories, they found forced laborers held behind barbed wire, people compelled to work for a company headquartered in Michigan. General Motors' German subsidiary, Opel, became one of the most important vehicle suppliers to the German military, helping power the Blitzkrieg campaigns that overran Poland and France. After the war, remarkably, the American government compensated General Motors for damage done to those very factories by Allied bombing raids. American taxpayers effectively paid to repair plants that had been building vehicles for the Army, trying to kill American soldiers. Then there's IBM, whose involvement is arguably the most disturbing of all. Under its chairman Thomas Watson, IBM's German subsidiary supplied the tabulating machines that became essential infrastructure for the Holocaust. These punch card systems weren't peripheral tools. They were used to conduct censuses that identified Jewish populations, to sort people into categories, and to help schedule deportations to concentration camps. Watson personally received a medal from the Nazi government in 1937, the same year he was writing admiring letters about the German leadership. Standard Oil's partnership with the German chemical conglomerate IG Farben, the same company that would manufacture the gas used in extermination camps, provided synthetic fuel technology that was genuinely critical to Germany's ability to wage a mechanized war, since the country lacked sufficient natural oil reserves of its own. By the mid-1930s, Standard Oil had acquired hundreds of thousands of acres of German land and built refineries that supplied the regime with refined petroleum, while its technical partnership with IG Farben helped Germany manufacture synthetic fuel on an industrial scale. That mattered enormously because Germany simply did not sit on the kind of natural oil reserves a mechanized offensive military campaign requires. Without that synthetic fuel technology, the kind of fast-moving tank warfare Germany waged across Poland and France would have been logistically impossible to sustain. Meanwhile, IBM's German subsidiary was quietly growing its balance sheet year after year through the 1930s, even as its machines were doing the accounting work of persecution, tracking populations by category with a speed and precision no government bureaucracy could have matched on paper alone. Senator Harry Truman, who would later become president, publicly used the word treason to describe Standard Oil's wartime conduct, and at least one federal judge suggested the company's continued cooperation with IG Farben after America formally entered the war could meet the constitutional definition of treason. Not one executive from any of these companies was ever criminally charged. To be clear, none of this suggests some coordinated plot to install Hitler for ideological reasons. What it suggests is something more mundane and in some ways more disturbing, that for a meaningful slice of the corporate world, profit consistently outweighed any moral reckoning with what that profit was funding. Now let's talk about appeasement. because the popular version of this story turns Neville Chamberlain into a simple cautionary tale, a naive old man waving a piece of paper and declaring peace in our time while Churchill alone saw the danger clearly. The real picture is more complicated, and understanding why makes the failure feel less like one man's blindness and more like a systemic collapse. Britain in the late 1930s was genuinely unprepared for a major war. Its military had been deliberately shrunk after the First War. Its air force was still being rebuilt, and its generals were telling Chamberlain, bluntly, that Britain could not win a war against Germany in 1938. France was in an even more fragile position, having lost over 1 million soldiers in the previous war, an entire generation of young men. The psychological scar tissue from that loss shaped French politics in ways that made almost any option preferable to a repeat. When Chamberlain flew to Munich in September 1938 to negotiate over Czechoslovakia's Sudetenland, he wasn't simply capitulating out of weakness. He was trying to buy time for rearmament. Whether that time was worth the moral price is one of history's genuine debates, and the moral price was severe. Czechoslovakia wasn't even invited to the negotiations over its own territory. Britain and France, acting in the name of European stability, handed a chunk of a sovereign democratic nation to a fascist dictatorship without consulting its government at all. Czechoslovakia had one of the best equipped militaries in Central Europe at the time, with fortified defensive positions along its mountainous border. Giving away the Sudetenland didn't just cost territory, it stripped away that entire defensive line and handed Germany access to a substantial industrial base. Churchill called the resulting agreement a total and unmitigated defeat, and he said so at a moment when that view was deeply unpopular. Chamberlain returned home to cheering crowds, having promised peace in our time, and within 6 months, Hitler had violated the core promise of the agreement entirely, absorbing the rest of Czechoslovakia in March 1939 without so much as a pretense of negotiation. But there's a layer beneath the surface of appeasement that's rarely discussed with much honesty, and it matters. A meaningful portion of the British and French establishment, along with plenty of American financial interests, viewed a strong Germany not primarily as a threat, but as a useful counterweight to the Soviet Union. The phrase circulating in certain circles was something close to better Hitler than Stalin. That belief, even held partially, gave people every incentive to move slowly against German rearmament, to keep trade routes open, to keep loans flowing, and to look away from what was being built inside Germany's borders. This wasn't some hidden conspiracy. It was a quieter, more mundane kind of institutional bias, a shared class instinct that shaped policy without ever being spoken aloud in a formal meeting. Then, in August 1939, the last remaining obstacle in Hitler's path disappeared in a single, stunning diplomatic maneuver. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, two regimes that had spent years denouncing each other in the most vicious terms, signed a non-aggression pact. Publicly, it looked like a simple agreement not to attack one another. Privately, in secret protocols, the Soviet government would deny existed for decades. It was a plan to carve up Eastern Europe between them. For Hitler, if he was going to invade Poland, and he absolutely intended to, he needed certainty that the Soviets wouldn't intervene. For Stalin, the calculation was different, but equally cold. The West had just shown at Munich that it would sacrifice a smaller nation rather than risk war. Stalin reasonably concluded that the Soviet Union might be next on that same list, and decided it was smarter to buy time and territory through a deal with Germany than to stand alone and hope the West would eventually help. The secret protocols divided Poland along river lines, with the western half going to Germany and the eastern half to the Soviet Union. Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and part of Romania were marked as Soviet spheres of influence. When German tanks rolled into Poland on September 1st, 1939, it wasn't a single rogue act. It was the opening move of an agreement two totalitarian powers had already made in secret. 16 days later, the Red Army crossed into Poland from the other direction, exactly as planned. Within a month, a nation of tens of millions of people had effectively been erased from the map, carved up by two armies that had coordinated the whole operation in advance. Britain and France declared war on Germany. Notably, they did not declare war on the Soviet Union, even though it had invaded the same country at the same time. That asymmetry says a great deal about how deeply anti-communist thinking had already warped Western judgment by that point, a bias that had been building quietly for most of the preceding decade. So when you step back and look at the full sequence, a very different picture emerges from the one most people were taught. The war we all think we understand didn't begin with one man's ambition. It began with a punitive peace treaty that manufactured decades of German resentment. It began with an unpunished invasion in Manchuria that taught every ambitious regime on earth that aggression carried no real cost. It began in corporate boardrooms where executives decided that profit mattered more than the nature of the regime generating it. It began in the calculations of British and French leaders who saw fascism as a useful shield against communism and moved too slowly as a result. And it began in a secret agreement between two dictators who divided a continent between them before either army had fired a shot in the war everyone remembers, as starting in September 1939. None of these individual decisions, taken alone, guaranteed the catastrophe that followed. Each one made a kind of narrow sense to the people making it at the time. The Allied negotiators at Versailles genuinely believed they were securing lasting French security. The corporate executives believed they were protecting shareholder value. Chamberlain believed he was buying essential time for a rearmament program his own generals told him Britain desperately needed. Stalin believed he was protecting Soviet borders after being excluded from Munich. Hitler, watching all of this unfold, correctly believed the world would keep giving ground. Put together, these choices formed a single continuous chain of failure, stretching from a palace outside Paris in 1919 to a railway explosion in Manchuria in 1931. To a series of corporate contracts throughout the 1930s, to a conference room in Munich in 1938, to a secret pact signed in Moscow in August 1939. This matters for reasons well beyond a history classroom. Treating the war as the product of one uniquely evil man makes the whole event feel like a freak occurrence, an aberration that could never happen again because it required someone as singularly monstrous as Hitler. The more uncomfortable truth is that the war was made possible by ordinary institutional failure, spread across many countries, many industries, and many years. It was made possible by economic humiliation left to fester, by an international body with no enforcement power, by corporations that valued profit over conscience, and by diplomats who convinced themselves that the danger in front of them was less urgent than the danger they imagined lurking behind it. Hitler was the spark, undeniably, but the fuel had been stacked for 2 decades by people who never intended to build a war, and who mostly convinced themselves, right up until the moment German tanks crossed into Poland, that they still had time to change course. That's really the point worth sitting with. Nothing about the deadliest conflict in human history was inevitable. It was constructed, decision by decision, treaty by treaty, contract by contract, and silence by silence by thousands of people, who each had the power to choose differently and mostly didn't. Understanding that isn't just an academic exercise. It's a warning about how easily institutions fail when short-term interest quietly overrides long-term consequence. A warning that remains just as relevant today as it was in 1939. If there's one thing worth carrying away from all of this, it's a healthy suspicion of tidy explanations for messy catastrophes. Whenever a historical disaster gets reduced to a single villain and a single date, it's worth asking who benefits from that simplicity and what harder truths get quietly left out of the frame. The people who signed contracts with a genocidal regime, the diplomats who calculated that fascism was the lesser evil, the officials who watched an invasion in Manchuria and decided a strongly worded report was sufficient response. None of them appear in the version of this story that fits on a single page of a textbook. But they were there. They made choices. And those choices mattered just as much as anything that happened on a battlefield. The next time someone tells you a catastrophe was inevitable, it's worth remembering how many ordinary people in ordinary offices had the chance to make a different choice at some point along the way, and simply didn't. If this kind of deeper historical breakdown was useful to you, consider subscribing to the channel and sharing this video with someone who only ever learned the simplified textbook version of these events. There's a lot more of this hidden history worth unpacking together, and we'll keep digging into it in the videos ahead. So stick around for what comes next.